He once told her she didn't matter, but somewhere between her silence and my gaze I realized she was the only person who ever truly did. I remember the moment as if it were carved into me. It wasn't even directed at me, it was him, her husband, speaking across a crowded dinner table. His voice was careless, almost joking, but his words carried a weight that settled deep in the room. "You don't really matter in things like this." Everyone else laughed, as though it were nothing more than a throwaway comment, the kind of line people brush past when wine is flowing and plates are being passed around. But I noticed her. She smiled, the way people do when they've trained themselves not to flinch. Her lips curved politely, her laugh joined the others, but her eyes told a different story. For just a second they dimmed, like a candle bent under a sudden breeze. I shouldn't have been watching her as closely as I was. I was 20-something, she was in her early 40s, beautiful in a way that didn't announce itself, but carried itself quietly, gracefully. She belonged to a world above mine, a world where I was supposed to sit, observe, and not get drawn in. Yet my gaze always found her. That night, I saw the tremor in her hand as she reached for her wineglass. I saw the subtle tightening of her shoulders, like a fortress suddenly remembering why it was built. She tilted her head just slightly, turning away as if she were listening to someone else's story, but I knew she was only trying to hide the sting. And still, somehow, she carried herself with such poise. No one else at that table noticed the shift, but I did. It broke something inside me, watching someone so composed, so radiant, be diminished with a single careless phrase. When her eyes lifted and briefly met mine, I froze. It wasn't a long look, just a fleeting connection, but in that moment, I swear she saw that I had noticed. I hadn't laughed. I hadn't brushed it off. I had seen her pain, and she knew it. It was like a silent thread tied between us in that instant. The kind of thread you don't choose, but one that forms because it must. I don't think she meant to send anything across that table, but I felt it anyway. A quiet acknowledgement. Maybe even gratitude. The conversation carried on, light-hearted and shallow. People debated vacations, compared wines, talked about promotions. Yet all I could hear was the echo of those words. "You don't really matter." It haunted me, because it wasn't true. She mattered. More than anyone in that room, she mattered. And though I was only a bystander that night, too young, too quiet, too much of an outsider to speak up, I carried that wound with me as if it were my own. It was the beginning of everything. The first time I realized she wasn't just someone I admired from a distance, she was someone I couldn't ignore. Someone whose worth, to me, would become undeniable. It was a few days later when I saw her again. Not in a crowded room this time, not surrounded by laughter and noise, but alone, tucked into the corner of a cafe that smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted beans. She didn't notice me at first. Her head was bent over a notebook, her pen moving slowly across the page. The window beside her let in a soft wash of afternoon light, and for a moment she looked almost untouchable, framed by the quiet glow. I hesitated. Part of me thought I should leave her alone, let her have her space. But something stronger pulled me forward, the memory of her smile that hadn't reached her eyes, the way she had carried that careless wound without letting anyone see it. So I walked over slowly, and asked if the seat across from her was taken. She looked up. For half a second, I thought she might turn me away. But then her lips curved into a small, polite smile, and she nodded. "Go ahead," she said, her voice soft, a little tired. I sat down, feeling oddly out of place yet strangely anchored by her presence. There was a pause, the kind that could have been awkward if it weren't filled with the quiet hum of the cafe around us. Steam curled from the mug in front of her, untouched, the coffee cooling as though she had forgotten it entirely. "What are you writing?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her pen stilled. She glanced at the notebook, then back at me, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Just thoughts," she said finally. Her eyes searched mine, perhaps checking for judgment. I only nodded, careful not to press. We slipped into conversation, light at first, the weather, the taste of the coffee, the book lying beside her on the table. But beneath her calm words, I felt something heavier. A weariness. A quiet weight she carried carefully, as if she didn't want anyone to notice. At one point, I reached for the small bowl of sugar between us. My hand brushed hers, just barely. It was accidental, fleeting. But she didn't pull back. Instead, her fingers lingered for the briefest moment against mine, cool and delicate, before retreating. And then, she smiled. Not the polite smile she had given me when I first sat down, but something warmer. Smaller, yes, but real. I don't think she knew what that smile did to me. It was like the room shifted, like all the quiet noise of clinking cups and murmured conversations faded into the background. For the first time, I felt as though I wasn't just sitting across from her. I was sitting with her. We talked a little longer, nothing profound, nothing life-changing. But when she finally closed her notebook and stood to leave, she looked at me and said, "Thank you for sitting with me." And I understood. She hadn't needed words of comfort. She had needed presence. And somehow, I had given her that. It was a small moment, almost ordinary. But to me, it felt like the beginning of something quietly extraordinary. It was evening when we found ourselves walking side by side. I hadn't planned it, either had she. We had left the same gathering, the kind of small social thing where everyone said too much and nothing at all, and somehow our paths simply aligned. The streets were quiet, lined with jasmine bushes that released their fragrance into the cooling air. She walked a step ahead at first, her pace measured, her shoulders drawn back the way they always were, poised, composed. But there was something different about her that night. A heaviness she didn't bother to disguise. I matched her stride, not pushing for conversation. Sometimes silence feels like respect. Sometimes it's the only way trust begins. After a while, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but the words carried weight. "Do you know what people don't realize?" she said, eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It isn't the silence that hurts. It's the words. The ones that dig in and stay long after the moment is gone." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew this wasn't a place for advice or comfort. This was a place for listening. She glanced at me then, as if testing whether I was really paying attention. I was. Every word sank deep. Her arm brushed against mine as we walked, just a faint touch, unintentional, but enough to make me aware of the space between us, and how fragile that space was becoming. She exhaled, a little laugh that wasn't really a laugh. "It's foolish, isn't it? To let words, just words, have that kind of power." I shook my head. "It's not foolish. It just means you cared. That's never foolish." For a moment, she stopped walking. I stopped too. Her hand hung at her side, clenched, as if she were holding something back. And then, slowly, she let it loosen. Her eyes glistened, though she blinked quickly, unwilling to let the tears fall. "I don't know why I'm saying this to you," she whispered. Before I could think, I reached out, not to pull her close, not to cross a line I shouldn't, but simply to cover her hand with mine. My palm pressed lightly against her fingers, steady, unhurried. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me. There was silence, thick and fragile, but not uncomfortable. For the first time, I felt the wall she carried around her heart crack, just slightly. She didn't pull away. She didn't add another mask of composure. Instead, she let her hand rest beneath mine, a quiet surrender. In that moment, I understood something. She didn't need me to fix her wounds. She only needed someone who noticed, someone who would stand there in the dark with her, unafraid of the pieces she hid from the rest of the world. And for the first time, I felt she trusted me enough to let those pieces show. It was late, and we had found a bench beneath the soft glow of a street lamp. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough. She lowered herself onto the bench first, smoothing the fabric of her skirt in a gesture that felt more like a shield than a habit. I sat beside her, not too close, not too far, careful with the space we shared. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air between us carried everything unspoken, the heaviness of her past, the quiet pull I couldn't ignore, and the awareness of what set us apart. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was a fragility beneath it. "You realize there are years between us," she said. "Years you haven't lived yet, and years I can't get back." Her words didn't sting. They only made me look at her more closely, at the faint lines near her eyes that deepened when she frowned, at the grace she carried even when doubt weighed her down. She was worried about time, about perception, about rules no one had written but everyone seemed to follow. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and let out a slow breath. "I know," I admitted. "But I also know what I feel when I'm around you." She turned to me then, and the look in her eyes was almost painful in its honesty. "You're too young to understand this." Her voice trembled, just enough to betray how much she cared about the words. I didn't rush to reply. Instead, I let the silence linger, because sometimes silence speaks more clearly than sound. Then, softly, I said, "Maybe. But I understand you." The words hung between us like something fragile, something that could shatter if either of us moved too quickly. Her gaze faltered, drifting down to her hands folded in her lap. I watched as she traced invisible lines against her skin with her thumb, a small nervous habit. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the air thicken with everything we weren't saying. The closeness, the hesitation, the quiet ache of wanting and not daring. Finally, she lifted her eyes again. For the first time, there was a flicker of something different there, not dismissal, not caution, but a spark she tried to hide. A spark that betrayed her own heart. And then it happened, the faintest curve of her lips. A smile so small, so reluctant, that anyone else would have missed it. But I saw it. And it told me more than words ever could. We didn't move closer that night. We didn't need to. The tension was enough, alive and steady between us, weaving its way into the silence. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just care. It was something deeper, something neither of us dared name yet. And though she carried the years between us like a shield, I could already see the cracks forming in her armor. It happened on a rainy evening. The streets shimmered with reflections of streetlights, and I found myself at her door with a small bag in hand. She had called earlier, her voice faint, apologetic. She hadn't meant to bother me, she said, but she wasn't feeling well. I could hear it in her tone, exhaustion wrapped in fragility. When she opened the door, I saw it more clearly. Her skin was pale, her movements slower than usual. The poise she always carried seemed dulled, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "I brought soup," I said quietly, holding up the bag. Her lips curved in a weak smile. "You didn't have to, I wanted to," I replied, stepping inside as she moved aside. The house was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of silence that makes you lower your voice instinctively. I set the bag on the counter and poured the soup into a bowl, the steam rising in gentle curls. She sat at the table, her head resting in her hand, watching me with tired eyes. When I placed the bowl in front of her, she gave me a look, soft, almost incredulous, as though she wasn't used to someone tending to her in this way. She took a few slow sips, then set the spoon down. "You're too kind," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I shook my head. "It's not kindness. It's just what you deserve." For a while, we didn't speak. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing, her breathing steadying. I watched the rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her body seemed to surrender to the comfort of the moment. When she swayed slightly, I moved to her side. "Come on," I said softly. "You should lie down." She didn't resist. Her hand slipped into mine as I helped her to the couch, her fingers cool against my skin. She lowered herself onto the cushions, curling slightly, and I sat beside her. She leaned against me without hesitation, her head resting against my chest. The weight of her trust pressed into me, warm and fragile. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her carefully, afraid to disturb the fragile peace she had allowed herself. The rhythm of her breathing slowed, steady, syncing with mine. I could feel the faint flutter of her heartbeat through the closeness of her body, and it did something to me, something quiet, something irreversible. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke, half drowsy. "You make me feel like I matter." The words struck me harder than I could have prepared for. My throat tightened, my chest ached with the tenderness of it. I lowered my head slightly, whispering against her hair. "You always did." She didn't answer. Perhaps she hadn't even heard me, sleep was already tugging her under. But I stayed there, still and steady, letting her rest against me. That night changed everything. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic. But in the quiet weight of her leaning on me, I felt the shift. We were no longer just two people passing through each other's lives. We belonged right there, in that moment. The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled in the distance, the kind that shakes windows and makes the night feel heavier than it is. I had come by to check on her, still worried after seeing how worn down she'd been. We were in her living room when the lights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. The house fell into darkness, save for the faint silver of rain-streaked moonlight filtering through the curtains. She sighed softly. "The power's gone again." I found a few candles in the drawer by her kitchen, lit them, and placed them on the coffee table. Their glow painted the room in shades of amber, soft and uneven, shadows moving gently along the walls. She sat close, wrapped in a blanket, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. The candlelight softened her face, smoothing the worry lines, making her look both older and younger all at once, timeless, really. We didn't talk much. There was no need. The storm filled the silence with its rhythm, and the candles filled the darkness with their flicker. At some point, our hands found each other on the couch between us. It wasn't planned. My fingers brushed hers lightly, almost by accident, but instead of pulling away, she let them linger. Slowly, deliberately, her hand turned over, palm open, inviting. I slid my fingers into hers, and she closed around them. Our palms pressed together, warm and steady. The simplest of gestures, yet it felt like everything. She looked at me then, her eyes reflecting the candlelight, deep and searching. I held her gaze, though my chest tightened under the weight of it. Neither of us said what was trembling in the air, but it was there, undeniable. Her thumb moved, just slightly, tracing the line of my hand. A touch so small, so fragile, and yet it made every nerve in me come alive. The silence stretched, long enough to feel eternal. And then, in the faintest whisper, she spoke. "Don't let go." My heart lurched. The storm rumbled outside, the rain beating against the windows, but all I could hear was her voice, the plea in it, the truth it carried. I tightened my grip gently, not to trap her, but to assure her. "I won't," I said, my voice low, steady, meant only for her. She leaned ever so slightly closer, her shoulder pressing against mine, her head turning just enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath near my cheek. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The intimacy of that closeness, of her trust resting so openly in my hand, was far greater than any rush of passion. We sat there as the storm raged on, her fingers laced with mine, her body resting against me, both of us held in the fragile safety of the candlelight. It was a confession without words. A promise spoken in silence. And it was more powerful than anything either of us could have said aloud. Morning came gently, as though the night itself had decided to ease us back into the world. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool, the streets washed clean beneath a pale sunrise. We stepped outside together. She walked beside me, her coat pulled lightly around her shoulders, her hair still carrying the faintest waves from the night before. There was no need for words. The silence between us had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, familiar, something that felt like ours. The world around us was just waking. Shops were unlocking their doors, the smell of bread drifted from a nearby bakery, and birds were perched on wires, shaking off the rain. But all I noticed was her. The way the morning light touched her face, softening every line, giving her an unguarded glow. She laughed then, not loud, not forced, but freely. A sound so genuine I realized I hadn't heard it before, not like this. It was lighter, unchained, as if some invisible weight had finally slipped from her shoulders. I smiled without meaning to. "You should laugh like that more often," I said. She glanced at me, a teasing spark in her eyes. "Maybe I just needed the right company." The words caught me off guard, settling somewhere deep. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, as if even breathing too deeply might shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. We kept walking, our hands brushing once, twice, before finally finding each other. This time, there was no hesitation. Her fingers slipped between mine, and they stayed there, interlaced, easy, as though they had always belonged that way. People passed us without notice. To the world, we were just two figures on a quiet morning walk. But to me, it felt like the most extraordinary truth. She had chosen to be here, beside me. I thought back to that night at the dinner table, when he had said she didn't matter. How those words had landed like a stone in my chest. How she had smiled to cover the sting. And now, here she was. Her hand in mine. Her laughter filling the morning air. She didn't need to say it, but I felt it anyway. She mattered. To me, more than anyone ever had. I wanted to tell her, to put it into words, but something held me back. Not fear, just the understanding that she already knew. Sometimes love doesn't need to be spoken to be heard. As we turned down a quiet street, the sunlight broke fully through the clouds, spilling over us in a gentle warmth. She squeezed my hand, a small, steady pressure that carried more meaning than any sentence could. And in that moment I knew, she may have once been told she didn't matter. But to me, she wasn't just someone who mattered. She was the only one who ever truly did.